Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. I hope you're all doing well. I missed you all last week. I have been working on multiple cases at once, just trying to kind of get ahead of myself a little bit. So I really needed that extra week to sort of finalize my next few videos. So today we're talking about a very disturbing case that took place in the 1920s. It involves two separate family massacres, both committed by the same person, a man named George Jefferson Hassell. George was married 3 times throughout his life, and he went on to completely wipe out 2 of those wives and their children. Just before Christmas in 1926, he brutally murdered his 3rd wife and 8 children. And once police finally caught up with him and they started grilling him about the murders, George revealed that this was not the first family that he'd massacred. Throughout this video, we're going to be talking about a lot of disturbing topics, including incest, abuse in pretty much every way imaginable, and of course the murder of multiple children. So just a warning, today's case is a pretty disturbing one. Before we get into today's case, I'd like to talk to you all about today's sponsor, Drift. Drift is Scentbird's new sister company, and they create high-quality air care products for your car and home. You guys already know that I love Scentbird. They've sponsored my channel before, and I cannot say enough good things about them, so I was pretty pumped when I heard about Drift. Drift uses high-quality, top-notch essential and fragrance oils to craft the absolute best scents for your car and home. And they are completely free of harsh chemicals that are found in most fragrance products, so you can enjoy Drift knowing that you and your family aren't breathing in anything harmful. The scent that I'm currently using is called Grove, and it smells amazing. It's like a sweet citrus scent, and I've gotten so many compliments. And look how pretty the wood design is. It just looks so nice and sleek in my car. And the price point on the car products range from $9 to $15, so very affordable. Drift also offers a subscription to their car products, so you can get your refills sent straight to your door without ever having to worry about reordering. You'll receive a starter kit that includes your metal clip and your scent, and then you'll just start receiving your refills each month or whatever you choose as your delivery frequency. And the subscription is super flexible. You can change your delivery frequency or your scent choice anytime you want. You can also cancel anytime you want with zero hassle. One of my favorite things about the subscription is the scent of the month. These are limited scents that are only sent out during certain times of the year. And I really love the subscription feature. I am the epitome of holiday cheesiness, so receiving a themed holiday scent, it just speaks to my soul. I'm really excited to try out December's scent of the month. It's called Baked, and the notes are baked goods, tonka beans, sandalwood, and oat milk. Another one that I'm excited to try is called Coffee. I love coffee, and to me, not much tops the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Drift also offers candles, reeds, and room sprays for your home, and these make great gifts as well. And Christmas is right around the corner, so if there's someone in your life that likes to try out new fragrances, this would make a great gift. I love Drift. The car fresheners are designed to look nice, they smell absolutely amazing, and they're super affordable, so what's not to love? And Drift is offering my viewers 55% off when you click the link in the description box and you use my code SUMMER at checkout. I'm telling you that you will not regret giving Drift a try. Thanks again to Drift for sponsoring this video, and now let's jump into the case. On Christmas Eve of 1926, the people of Farwell, Texas were right in the middle of uncovering the gruesome details of a nightmare that had unfolded in their quiet little town. A 41-year-old woman named Susan Hassell and 8 of her 9 children had gone missing a few weeks earlier. Susan and her family were relatively new to the area. They had moved to Farwell, Texas from Oklahoma the previous year, and even though Susan didn't really have any super close friends in town, when she and her kids just suddenly disappeared in early December, people definitely noticed. And on Christmas Eve, after weeks of wondering where Susan and the kids were, the people of Farwell finally got their answer. Susan and her 8 children were found buried in a large pit in the backyard of their farmhouse. They had all been brutally murdered, thrown into the pit, and covered with dirt. And no one had to wonder who had massacred this entire family, because the townspeople already knew. The murderer was Susan's husband, George Hassell, and they were all about to find out that this was not George's first family massacre. He had done this exact same thing 10 years earlier. George Jefferson Hassell was born July 5th, 1888 in Smithfield, Texas, and he was the youngest of 7 children. His parents were James Hassell and Martha Stovall. We don't really know too much about them. A lot of what we know about George's early life comes from interviews that he did after this case broke, and he didn't give too much insight into what his parents were like, but we do know that he came from a long line of farmers, like generations of farmers, and his family were all members of the Methodist this religion. And his parents, especially his mother, was very, very religious. When George or any of his siblings would get into trouble, Martha's way of punishing them was to drag them out into the barn and make them kneel on the ground, and she would have them repeat long prayers as like a way of repenting for their sins. But according to George, his father disciplined in a much different way. George's father was said to be very physically abusive towards him and his siblings. His form of punishment was always physical, it was always aggressive, and he was said to be very hard on the children. George considered himself to be a very religious person when he was younger. Outwardly, he appeared to be this mostly well-behaved, very devout little boy, but according to George, he became completely infatuated with girls at a very young age. He was always thinking about girls and staring at the girls. He was always trying to charm the girls. And like I said, this started at a really young age. And so even though he considered himself very religious, he said he was always having these impure thoughts about girls and women. And so he started to feel like he was living a double life. One minute he would be attending church with his family. He would be, listening to the sermons and praying. And then the next minute he would be having these really strong sexual thoughts about women and girls. And he became totally obsessed and infatuated with them. I don't really know what these impure thoughts were. They could have been just the typical curious thoughts that most kids have. I've covered cases where children are made to feel like they are doing something wrong just for having normal, healthy thoughts and feelings. And this does happen a lot in like fanatically religious families. But George's interests definitely seem to be a little too advanced for his age. And he claims that at the age of only 8 years old, he set out to find someone to have sex with him. And according to George, he did find someone. And he said he lost his virginity to a 15-year-old girl when he was only 8 years old. And this sexual encounter just fueled his obsession with sex and with women. And this obsession never stopped. It just kept growing as he got older. So like I mentioned earlier, George's father was very physically abusive and he would beat the children on a regular basis, at least according to George. And after one especially brutal beating, George left home. And I'm not sure how old he was at this point. Unfortunately, with these really old cases, the dates get a little confusing. And a lot of the information that we have about George's early life comes from interviews that he himself gave after he was arrested for his crimes. And there are a lot of little details that have been proven to be false. Like the timeline that George gave just couldn't be right. In one interview, George claimed that after his mother died, his father got remarried and his new wife poisoned him and killed his father. And then when George found out about it, he got really drunk and went to his stepmother's house with the intentions of killing her and her children. But he passed out before he could kill them. Now, this story has pretty much all been disproven. For one thing, George's father died 4 years before his mother died. We know this because of the dates on death records. And as far as we know, his father never had another wife. So that's why I keep saying things like according to George or George claims, because we just don't know how much of his account of his childhood is actually true. But we do know that George did leave home at a pretty young age, supposedly because of a severely brutal beating from his father. After he left home, he got a job working as a freight wagon driver for a man named Sid Ross on a cotton farm. The cotton would be picked, and then George's job was to load it onto a horse-drawn wagon and then drive it over to the cotton gin. And this job actually started out really well for George. He had made a great first impression on Sid Ross, his boss, and so Sid started to really like George and he put a lot of trust in George. So Sid decided to give him a little more responsibility. He needed someone to travel to Abilene, Texas to deliver some cotton seeds. And during this delivery, he also needed some supplies picked up and a deposit to be made at the bank. This was a big deal. Sid did not just trust anyone with the company money, but George had become such a reliable member of the staff. Sid thought that George was the perfect person for the job. So George sets off towards Abilene with the cotton seeds and the money to deposit and the money for supplies. And instead of doing what he set out to do, he threw the cotton off the wagon, abandoned the team of horses and the wagon at a wagon yard, and then he took the money and he vanished. When George didn't show back up to work, Sid got suspicious and he went looking for George, and he very quickly realized what had happened. His trusted employee, George Hassell, had stolen his money and taken off. So Sid went straight to the police. The police did manage to track George George down at his sister's house in Fort Worth, Texas, and he was arrested on March 11th, 1907, and he ended up spending 2 years in prison. George would later claim that his experience in prison is what led him to become a murderer. He said, quote, "I firmly believe if they had allowed me to work out the money I took from my employers, I would have never committed any other crime." Back in the early 1900s, it was common for inmates to be sent to prison farms, and these farms were absolutely horrible places. It's been said that there were very few places in the world worse than a Texas prison farm. Teenage prisoners would be housed with adult prisoners, and there were no safeguards in place to protect the younger inmates from the older ones. So there would be a lot of physical violence towards the younger inmates, and not just the younger inmates, there was serious violence towards all of the prisoners, no matter their age, but it was especially bad for the younger, more vulnerable inmates. And this physical violence came from the other prisoners and the prison guards. The prisoners would be forced to work long hours in extreme conditions on the farms, and the guards would beat them with whips for pretty much any reason. And some of these whippings would be so brutal that the prisoners would lose consciousness. They would just black out. There were also a lot of rapes that were committed in the prison farms as well. And if the guards ever caught two inmates consensually having sex with each other, they would be dragged out into the yard and whipped in front of the other prisoners, and then they would be forced to have sex right there in the yard in front of everyone. They would also move the inmates around to different prison farms in the area, and the conditions would be worse depending on where you went. And this account is backed up by investigations that were later done on the Texas prison system. This was a real problem in these Texas prisons. They were absolutely appalling places to be. And this was George's life at the age of only 18 years old. This is what his life was like. In March of 1909, George was finally released from prison, but now he was broke. He had no job, he had nowhere to turn, no one to turn to, and no prospects, and now he has a criminal record. So what does George decide to do? He decides to head back to his last employer, Sid Ross, you know, the guy that he stole money from. He went back to Sid Ross and essentially begged him for another chance. He said that he had really changed, that, you know, he was really sorry for what he had done. He knew what he had done was wrong, and, you know, he would never betray Sid again. And he just really wanted a chance to prove himself. And amazingly, Sid actually agreed to let George come back and work for him on the cotton farm. George could be very, very charming and very persuasive. And so he managed to get back in Sid's good graces, and he got his job back. And not only did he get his job back, but Sid also let George live in one of his farmhouses. He had several farmhouses, and he let George stay there. And all George had to do was keep up the property, take care of the house, take care of the crops, stuff like that, and he could just live there for free. And not long after this, George would meet the woman that he would later call the only woman he ever truly loved, his first wife, Minnie Laughlin. Minnie was around the same age as George. They were both in their early 20s, and Minnie was very, very close with her parents. They were very involved in Minnie's life, and they did not like George at all. They knew that he was fresh out of prison, so that was strike one for them. And they also just felt like he was shifty. There was something about him that they just didn't like. But no matter how hard they tried to talk Minnie out of this relationship, she wouldn't listen. She was in love with George. So just a few months after meeting, Minnie and George got married, and they went on to have a son that they named James Delbert. But this was not wedded bliss like Minnie was hoping. And we don't know any of the little details about what happened while they were married, but we do know that Minnie was not happy with George at all, and pretty soon after they got married, she was wanting out. George did start drinking very heavily around this time, and he started to become more and more abusive. And I'm just speculating here, but if George really was as obsessed with sex and obsessed with women as he claimed to be, I would imagine that he probably cheated on Minnie, or maybe he was like forcing her to have sex with him all the time and she didn't want to. Again, that's just speculation, but there were obviously issues in this marriage. We know he became violent, and we know that Minnie wanted out not long after getting married. And that wasn't very common back then. Women typically would stay in abusive relationships. It took a lot for someone to walk away from a marriage, especially if they had a child. Now, George had 3 wives throughout his life, but Minnie was the only one that managed to escape the marriage alive, but she just barely escaped. George had made attempts on Minnie's life during the course of their marriage. He had attempted to kill her on more than one occasion, and he didn't just try to kill Minnie. He also also attempted to kill his infant son as well. And I wish that I had more information on these murder attempts, but there isn't much known about this. The only reason we even know that George tried to kill Minnie and James is because later on in life, when James grew up and he became curious about his father, this was after George's murders and arrest and everything, James reached out to the state of Texas to see if he could get some of the interview transcripts and stuff. He just wanted to know more information about his father. You know, he wanted to understand what made his father tick and who his father was and why he had killed so many people. And in that letter that he wrote to the state of Texas, James actually mentions that George had tried to kill him and his mother while Minnie and George were still married. And so obviously this marriage was not a good one. And after just a few years of marriage, Minnie took James and she went home to her parents in Texas. And Minnie actually stayed in hiding for years after she left George. And after knowing what George goes on to do in this case, there's no doubt in my mind that he would have killed them both if she would have stayed. When Minnie left, she didn't tell George that she was leaving. She just took off one day while he was in a different state for work. And she just sent him a letter telling him that she took the baby and she's leaving. And that's how he found out that his wife and son were gone. And George claims that this absolutely devastated him. He sunk into a deep depression and he just didn't know what to do with his life. So now George is single again. He's very down about his life and losing his wife and son, and he's also jobless again. He screwed over Sid Ross again. This time he had found a check of Sid's just lying around the farm, and this check had already been cashed. It wasn't valid, but George went down to the bank and managed to cash the check again. He took the money, which I think was only like $20, which I guess back then was significant. But yeah, he took the money and he pocketed it and then he took off. Sid didn't even bother pressing charges this time. He just let George go. But now George is unemployed again. He claims that he joined the Navy and deserted. Then he joined the Army under a different name and deserted again. He also got busted again for stealing. But somehow, despite all of this, in 1915, George managed to meet and charm another woman. This woman's name was Marie Vogel, and she would become George's second wife and his first known murder victim. Marie had been married before she met George, and she had a son from that marriage named Gerald. She would also go on to adopt 2 more young kids, and George would always claim that what attracted him to Marie was the fact that she had a son who was about the same age as his son would have been at the time. So like I said, George and Marie are now together, and they're living as this little family with Marie's 3 young kids, and at this point in the story, they're living in Southern California in a town called Whittier. Now, Marie and George never legally got married, as far as we know anyways. They were common law husband and wife. And one day in 1916, Marie's mother decided to go visit her daughter and her grandkids. And when she arrived, she found out that her daughter was married to George Hassell. Now, for whatever reason, Marie and George told her mother that George's last name was Baker. So she thinks his name is George Baker. Maybe he was paranoid about his past crimes and he didn't want anyone in the area to dig into his past. Or maybe George knew what he was eventually going to do to Marie and her children, and he was just trying to cover his tracks as best as he could. So during this trip, Marie's mother, whose name is Mrs. Serlin, by the way, I don't think I mentioned that, but the newspapers just refer to her as Mrs. Serlin. So during Mrs. Serlin's visit with her daughter and her grandchildren, and now her new son-in-law, she would say that she just felt like George was weird. He was just acting odd. We don't know any details like what he was doing that creeped her out so much. He just gave Mrs. Serlin the creeps. And she also said that he was very sullen, very solemn, very gloomy, just overall in just like a really shitty mood. So after her visit, she returned home. I don't know which state she lived in, but she lived in a different state. So she returned home and she just felt really uneasy about this new guy that her daughter and grandkids were now with. And those uneasy feelings would only get worse when not long after her visit, she received a letter from George Hassell, who, remember, she believes is named George Baker. And in this letter, George explains to Mrs. Serlin that he and Marie were no longer together. He said that Marie had packed up the kids and moved to Australia. But how? They had absolutely no money. How would Marie have managed to get not only herself, but also 3 young children from California to Australia? It just didn't make sense, but Mrs. Serlin just sort of accepted this at the time. I imagine that she was just happy that her daughter had left George. Maybe Marie had lied to George about Australia and she was actually on her way to her mother's house with the children. She probably thought, you know, good, my daughter finally is leaving this guy. My grandkids are going to be safe. They've escaped from this strange man. And so she just accepted it and hoped to hear from Marie soon. But it would be 10 years before Mrs. Serlin discovered what had actually happened to her daughter and her grandchildren. They had all been murdered by George Hassell. Over the years, George told multiple versions of this story, but it's thought that the actual true version of this story was one that George told an attorney years after his arrest. According to George, this is what happened the night that he brutally and systematically massacred his entire family. Things had been going really well for a while between him and Marie. He said that they were very happy together. They had, formed this little family unit, and he was actually doing well and thriving in this environment. But he said as time went on, Marie started to get on his nerves. He said that the house was always a mess. There were always clothes and toys everywhere, and it just started to drive him crazy. Then one night he came home from work and he and Marie started arguing about money. She told George that he wasn't giving her enough money, and I'm assuming that he was spending a lot of his money on alcohol. He was still drinking very, very heavily at this point, and Marie probably needed more money to take care of the house and the children. So they get into this argument about money, and George said he finally just snapped. The kids were being crazy. They were running around, they were crying, being loud. Then now this fight with Marie over money, the house was a mess. It just all drove him to his breaking point. And so in the blink of an eye, he grabbed Marie by her neck and strangled her to death. Then once she was dead, he decided that the kids needed to go as well. So one by one, he grabbed the children and strangled them all to death. And later, when the bodies are discovered, they were found with stockings and rope still tied around their necks. Gerald was only 8 years old when George murdered him, and the younger two were likely only around 4 or 5 years old. So these kids were so young. The neighbors later reported that George was acting strange in the days following the murders. First of all, he started digging a hole under the house, and he would be digging in this hole at all hours of the day and night, which the neighbors found odd. The houses in this neighborhood were all very close together, so if anything weird was happening in your house, your neighbors were going to know about it. If you were having a fight with your spouse, they were going to hear it. If there were any strange smells emanating from your house, the neighbors were going to notice. And the neighbors started to complain of a foul odor coming from the Hassell home. It was just this very strong foul smell that was like permeating through their walls. Then one night, one of the neighbors, a woman named Clara Shanker, saw George carrying out a large trunk and several smaller bundles, and he was putting all of this into that hole that he had dug under the house. George had buried Marie and the children in that hole. He had stacked all of their bodies on top of one another, and he had left ropes and stockings still tied around their necks. And then he covered them up with dirt, and he just hoped that no one would ever find them there. Now, George knew that the odor was going to be an issue. People were already making comments around the neighborhood about this terrible smell in the air. So in an attempt to cover the smell, George started burning rags on the stove in his house. He just set cloth rags on fire one by one over and over again, and he did this for days. And one of the neighbors actually saw him doing this. I guess she saw him through the window, which again, she found odd. And you might think that George would have left town. He would have wanted to put as much distance between himself and the murders. But no, he didn't do that at all. He actually stayed in that house, which after all of this was discovered and this case broke, this house became known as the death house. But he stayed in this house. He said that the murders didn't even really disturb his day-to-day life either. He just went back to living as normal. And of course, over time, the neighbors started asking about Marie and the kids. They hadn't seen them in days, and so they started asking questions. And when people would ask George, where's Marie? Where's the kids? He would tell them that Marie had left him for another man, and she had taken the kids with her. After several months of living in the death house, George did eventually leave, and when he disappeared, his neighbors really started to get suspicious. He didn't tell anyone that he was leaving. He just up and left. And when George left, when he disappeared, the neighbors really started talking. Everybody was kind of comparing notes and talking about all of George's strange behaviors leading up to his disappearance. And a part of them just didn't believe that Marie would have taken the kids and left with another man. So they didn't know how much they believed George's story. And they decided, okay, something bad might have happened here. Let's call the police. And so they decided to get the police involved. A constable did come out and investigate the property, but he didn't find anything. 10 years later, that same constable would find out that if he had investigated that hole under the house, he would have found the bodies of Marie and the kids. But for now, there are no answers. So everyone just tries to go back to normal, and they just try to forget all of this weird stuff that's happened. So for the next few years, George just traveled around. He would get jobs here and there. He joined the Merchant Marines, where he was a chef. And if you believe George, he just, traveled state to state having affairs affair after affair after affair with various women. And another thing that George liked to do was go visit one of his older brothers in Oklahoma. This brother's name was Tom, and Tom and George were actually very, very close. Tom was married to a woman named Susan, and they had 9 children together, and they lived on this really big farm in Oklahoma. And over the years, George would just, stop by randomly at the farm, and he would stay for several days, and he got very, very close to his nieces and nephews. They loved listening to their Uncle George's stories about all of his travels and adventures. He would even tell them about his sexual escapades as well, which I find weird. Like, why would you talk to your nieces and nephews about your sex life? But to them, he was this really cool, worldly uncle. After a while, things got creepy. George started to become a little too close to Tom and Susan's oldest daughter, Nora. By 1921, Nora was 18 years old, and according to George, she had become very, very fond of him, and she really wanted to go visit California with him. She just wanted to escape the mundane life on the farm and go see some of the world. So she asked her parents if she could go visit California with her Uncle George, and unfortunately, they agreed to let her go. So in 1921, George and Nora traveled from Oklahoma to California, and he took her around to see some of the places from his stories, and things seemed to be going really well for a while. But then things took a very disturbing turn. During the trip, George started sexually abusing his niece. He later said in an interview, quote, "It was a pleasant trip. I didn't get in a big hurry as we were sleeping together every night." Keep in mind, he's talking about his blood relative, his niece. So at this point, Nora is 18, so legally she was of age, but she was also his niece. She was his brother's daughter, the daughter that had been entrusted to him. He was supposed to protect her and make sure she was safe on this trip. The way George told this story, the sex was totally consensual between himself and Nora, but I don't believe that at all. I think it all started before they even left the farm in Oklahoma. He had arrived at Tom's farm for one of his random visits, and he noticed that his niece had grown into a woman by this point, and he probably started planting the seed in her mind about visiting California. But considering what he goes on to do later in the case, he actually could have been abusing Nora since she was much, much younger. And by the end of 1921, Nora was pregnant with her uncle's baby. So George is kind of in a panic because now he's gotten his niece pregnant, and he's supposed to bring her back to Oklahoma, but now he knows he can't do that. So he convinced Nora to find a man in California, marry him, and pass the baby off as his, which is exactly what she did. She went on to have a daughter that she named Georgia, presumably after her Uncle George, and she did stay in California and she built her life there. She never moved back to the farm in Oklahoma. And it's very fortunate for Nora that she decided to stay in California because she's the only one of Tom and Susan's kids that made it out alive. In July of 1924, George's brother Tom passed away, and the death of Tom would set into motion a series of events that would lead to the massacre of nearly his entire family. Now, the circumstances surrounding Tom's death are still debated to this day, so I'm going to do my best here. On July 3rd, 1924, Tom was working in his field when he suddenly died. Most accounts of this story place George there in the field with Tom when he died. The story goes, George and Tom were working in the field together when a mule suddenly kicked Tom in the head and killed him instantly. George then went and reported the death to Susan and the kids, and he was the only one that was there to witness Tom's death. But George would later say that he wasn't even in Oklahoma when Tom died. He said that Susan wrote to him to let him know that Tom was dead, and that she herself had asked him to come to the farm to help her take care of the kids and the crops and stuff. But this story really didn't check out. George moved around so much, he never really had an address. How would Susan have known where to even send the letter? It is believed by most people familiar with this case that George wanted what Tom had. He wanted the house and the family and the successful crops. He saw how well his brother was doing, and he wanted it for himself. So he had killed Tom that day in the field, and he just blamed it on a mule. And Susan received a life insurance payout of $1,100, which would be close to about $20,000 today. So it was a nice little sum of money she came into after Tom's death. I also believe that George wanted unlimited access to Tom's daughters as well. He wanted Tom out of the way so that he could abuse his nieces without anyone intervening. So after Tom's death, George starts helping Susan on the farm. He's helping with the house. He's helping with the kids. He's helping bring in the crops. He's really becoming an integral part of their day-to-day lives. And he's becoming sort of a stand-in for Tom in the kids' eyes. And eventually he and Susan start up a relationship. Now, some people believe that George and Susan were actually already having an affair before Tom died. But again, we don't know. That's just suspicion. Susan's family said that this marriage was just one of convenience. Susan had only married him because she needed help. I forgot to mention this, but Susan was pregnant at the time that Tom died. She was pregnant with their 9th child. So she had a lot on her plate. She desperately needed help. So George claimed that he and Susan sat down and they read through the Bible to find out if it was morally appropriate for the two of them to get married. And after reading through it, they decided that it was okay for them to get married. It was fine for him to marry his dead brother's widow. So only 4 months after Tom's death, Susan and George got married. Susan's family visited the farm a couple of times after she married George, and they would later say that they just never really knew George. They had been around him, but they didn't really know him as a person. They couldn't get a good read on him. But there was one visit that stood out to them. During a family reunion, George kind of let the mask slip, and everyone got to see his explosive temper. During this reunion, something happened and George got really upset about it, like really, really upset. And he would not shut up about it. He just kept going on and on and on about whatever this was. And he was just getting madder and madder and madder. He was shouting, he was storming around, just being really aggressive. And that night, he made Susan and the kids sleep outside. Susan's family had never seen George act like this before, so it really gave them some insight into how quick his temper could ignite. Then in December of 1925, a little over a year after George and Susan got married, George sold off the farm in Oklahoma, packed up the family, and they all moved to the Texas Panhandle to a town called Farwell, Texas. Farwell is like right on the border of Texas and New Mexico. And once they got there, they became tenant farmers. And everyone in town definitely took note of George and Susan and their huge family when they moved into town. And they would see them around town on occasion. George would make small talk, but no one ever really got to know George or Susan or the kids. They made some friendly acquaintances while they were living there, but nothing like a truly deep, significant relationship. The older kids were enrolled in school, but they only attended when they weren't needed on the farm. But their teachers said that they were all very, very intelligent kids. They made really good grades, they were nice, they were respectful, and they all had a really strong work ethic. That was one thing that everyone noticed about the Hassell family. They all worked extremely hard, and they rarely ever took a break. They were always doing projects on the farm, they were tending to the animals, bringing in crops. It was like a huge family affair. Everyone helped out. Now, as the months passed, Susan and George started to fight a lot, mostly about George's drinking. He was really into bootleg whiskey apparently, and Susan did not approve at all. They also had a lot of disagreements about how to discipline the children. George said that anytime he would try to discipline the kids, Susan would get upset and she would always take the kids' side. Then a few months before the murders, Susan and George started fighting over something much more disturbing. George had started sexually abusing one of his stepdaughters, which I want to remind everyone is also his niece. Now that Nora is living in California, the second oldest niece slash stepdaughter is 13-year-old Maddie. As far as we know, Maddie never told Susan about what George was doing to her, at least not at first. But in the summer of 1926, just a few months before George murdered the family, something happened that would finally out George as the sexual predator he was. It all started when Nora and her husband decided to travel to Farwell, Texas from their home in California for a visit. Nora hadn't seen her mother and her siblings in a while, so she and her husband, which was a man named Luke Guidry, but everybody called him Frenchie, they decided to pay her family a visit. So they leave Georgia back in California with a sitter and they make their way to Farwell, Texas. And it's summertime in Texas, so it's hot. It's really, really hot outside. And 13-year-old Maddie wanted to go swimming. They had this big tank full of water set up on the farm and she wanted to swim in it. But Maddie didn't know how to swim. She had never learned. So Nora's husband, Frenchie, offered to teach her how to swim. So Maddie borrowed a bathing suit from Nora, and then she and Frenchie went out to the water tank and he started to give Maddie a swimming lesson. At some point, Nora walked outside to check on Frenchie and Maddie, and she caught Frenchie touching her little sister in an inappropriate way. A huge fight broke out. Nora is screaming at Frenchie, then George and Susan get involved. Nora and Frenchie, they pack up and they head back to California. After this, Nora filed for divorce. This ended their relationship. But back on the Hassell farm, more and more horrible things start coming to light. The situation with Frenchie had opened up a conversation between Susan and Maddie. Susan asked Maddie if George had ever touched her inappropriately. And we actually don't know what Maddie told Susan when she asked her this question, but it did come out during this conversation that Maddie was pregnant. George had been raping his teenage stepdaughter and niece for months, and she was now pregnant. And by the looks of it, she was at least a few months along. Now, at this point, when Susan found out, Maddie already knew that she was pregnant, well before this whole thing with Frenchie. In fact, George also knew that Maddie was pregnant. They had figured it out weeks before, but George had made Maddie promise that she would never tell that the baby was his. Instead, he convinced her to tell everyone that she had had sex with one of her cousins, and that's how she got pregnant. So like I said, we don't know exactly how the conversation between Susan and Maddie went, but it is thought that Maddie did attempt to convince her mother that the cousin was the baby's father, but Susan wasn't buying it. She took Maddie to a doctor in town where it was confirmed that Maddie was in fact pregnant, and once all of this came out, even though at this point George is denying any abuse at all, Susan and George started having very frequent, very aggressive, loud arguments about Maddie. Susan was just not buying the story that this baby was the cousin's. She really believed that George was the father. And they started fighting non-stop about this, which George claimed caused him to drink more and more. He said that he even contemplated just packing up his stuff and just leaving in the middle of the night and just driving as far away from his problems as he could. But unfortunately, he didn't do that. And because he chose to stay, 9 people were about to lose their lives. So in October of 1926, just 2 months before George murders his family, some of the neighbors noticed that the Hassell children were digging a massive pit in their backyard. George had instructed them to dig this massive pit, and this struck the neighbors as odd because they didn't see a need for it. The family already had areas to store their stuff. They had pantries to store their canned food and stuff, so what was this pit for? And also, they were digging this pit right off the back of the house, only like 6 to 10 feet from the back door. The neighbors would see the children out there with shovels and picks digging in the pit over the course of several weeks. And what the children didn't know is that they were actually digging their own graves. And by early December, the pit was complete and George set his plan into motion. Now, I will note here that George never admitted that what he goes on to do was premeditated, but based on the evidence and all of the stuff leading up to the murders, it's highly unlikely that he didn't have this planned out weeks in advance. So it's now early December, and despite everything that was going on in the family, Susan was said to be very excited about Christmas. You know, she loved Christmas, and her birthday was on Christmas Eve. So she was really looking forward to spending quality time with her kids over the holidays. But Susan and the kids had no idea that they would never make it to Christmas. This is George Hassell's account of what happened the night he massacred Susan and his 8 nieces and nephews. On the night of December 2nd, 1926, George and Susan were lying in bed, along with the youngest of the children, 2-year-old Sammy. The other children were piled into a few beds in 2 other bedrooms in the house. Susan and George started arguing about Maddie again, and Susan had also found out that her granddaughter Georgia was actually George's baby, so now she knows that he's abused another one of her daughters. Susan was not letting this go, understandably. Maybe she was even trying to kick George out of the house. We don't know. But we do know that George got fed up with Susan bringing up Maddie and the baby, and so he got up and he went out to the shed and he started drinking whiskey. Susan hated the fact that George drank. He had promised her over and over again that he was going to stop, and he never did. So when he came back into the house and laid back down next to her, she immediately smelled whiskey on his breath and she was pissed. George said that Susan then started yelling at him about his drinking, and in that moment he snapped. There was a ball-peen hammer sitting near the bed. He grabbed it and he smashed Susan twice in the face. But Susan wasn't dead yet, so to finish the job, he decided to strangle her to death. He started off using his hands to strangle her, but then he grabbed some stockings and tied them around her throat, and he just pulled as hard as he could, which eventually killed her. So now he has Susan's dead body in the room. There's blood everywhere, and 2-year-old Sammy has just seen everything, and he's crying, he's upset, he's scared. So George said that he panicked because of all the noise that Sammy was making, so he grabbed him and he strangled him to death as well. At that moment, George could have just fled. The other kids were still asleep in the other rooms. He literally could have just left. But instead, he decided to kill each and every one of his nieces and nephews. Now, there were a lot of kids living in this this house. So they all had to share not only rooms, but also beds. So multiple kids would sleep in one bed together. So the first room that George entered had 2 beds. One of the beds was where Maddie slept with her 4-year-old sister Nanny, and the other bed belonged to 7-year-old David and 6-year-old Johnny. And starting with 4-year-old Nanny, George strangled each of the 3 younger kids, just one by one, silently strangling them until they died. And he would actually later say that he was really impressed with himself that he managed to kill each kid without making a sound and waking the other ones up. He thought that he was really something special for being able to do that. So after he had killed 4-year-old Nanny, 6-year-old Johnny, and 7-year-old David, he then turned his focus to Maddie. Maddie was still asleep when George took the same hammer that he'd used on Susan, and he bashed Maddie in the head 2 times as hard as he could. And then he strangled her to death. So now George has completely wiped out another room of people, but there's still one room to go. The last bedroom belonged to the boys, 15-year-old Virgil, 11-year-old Russell, and 21-year-old Alton. But Alton wasn't home at the time. He was actually working out of state to earn a little extra money for the family, but he was due to come home any day now. So George starts slowly making his way to the boys' room, but on his way, he decided to grab the family gun from the kitchen and hide it in the dining room. It's thought that he did this because he was a little afraid of his stepsons. They had worked on farms their entire lives, doing lots of strenuous things, and they had grown into very strong boys. It said that they were about as strong as a fully grown man. So it's believed that George was a little worried that his nephews might overpower him, and that's why he hid the gun in the dining room, just in case he needed to run and get it. So he puts the gun in the dining room, then he heads to the boys' room. But when he goes inside, he realizes that Russell is missing. Virgil is asleep in the bed, but he doesn't know where Russell is. So he leaves the room and he starts searching the house for Russell, and he finally finds him asleep in the living room. So he taps Russell on the shoulder and he tells him, get up, you need to go to your bed. So Russell gets up and he goes into the bedroom with Virgil, but when he walked in, it woke Virgil up. He thought that it was his oldest brother Alton and that Alton had finally made it home. So Virgil's, kind of out of it. He's really groggy and he asks, is Alton back? And George says, no, he's not back yet. Just, you need to go back to sleep. But now George has a problem. He needs these boys to be asleep so that he can kill them. He wants to do this silently so that they don't alert one another and potentially overpower him. So George decides to just wait them out, let them fall back into a deep sleep before he attacks. So he walks out of the room and he goes into the front room and he just sits by the fire and he just waits. But after a while, Virgil walked into the front room and he sat down next to George and he says, I can't get back to sleep. Can I just sit out here with you? And so George reluctantly says yes, and they just sit there and stare at the fire for a while. And Virgil has no clue that most of his family is dead in the other rooms of the house. And after a while, it's obvious that Virgil isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and George is kind of racing against the clock. He needs to do this before the sun comes up, so he needs to come up with a plan. He decides to go back into the boys' room and kill Russell, who is now asleep. Then he'll come out and he'll shoot Virgil. So he gets up and he leaves Virgil by the fire and he makes his way back to the boys' room. Now he was really hoping to silently strangle Russell like he had the others, but that did not happen. George was right to assume that the older boys would fight back because that's exactly what Russell did. As soon as George started strangling him, he woke up and he started fighting back. He was flailing all around and using all of his strength to get George off of him. And he fought so hard that George had to grab an axe and hit Russell with it just to subdue him enough so that he could strangle him. This fight was not quiet. Russell was making a lot of noise, and this alerted Virgil. He starts hearing all of these weird noises coming from his brother, and so he jumps up and he runs into the room to investigate. And that's when he sees his uncle on top of his brother trying to kill him. Virgil immediately goes into action. He grabs George off of Russell, and now he and George are on the floor and they're fighting. Russell is wounded at this point from the axe, but he does manage to get up and he grabs a brick and he hits George with it. But George managed to scramble to his feet and he starts running for his failsafe, the gun that he hid in the dining room. Virgil jumps up and he takes off after George, but by the time he catches up to him, George already had the gun in his hand and he shot 15-year-old Virgil directly in the chest, killing him instantly. And now he only has one person left in the house that he needs to take care of, 11-year-old Russell. Russell had managed to run and hide after Virgil was shot, but unfortunately George did find him. He was hiding in the corner of a closet, and George strangled him right there in the closet using his hands and stockings. And what's so sad is that throughout the entire attack on Virgil and Russell, they were both yelling out for their mother and their sister Maudie for help, which is so heartbreaking. They had no idea that everyone in the house was dead. Now George has killed everyone in the house, and he knows that he needs to bury the bodies. The sun will be up soon, and he needs to do this under the cover of darkness. And of course, this is where the pit comes in, the pit that the children had been digging for weeks, totally unaware that they were digging their own graves. So he moves Virgil first. He rolled his body onto a blanket and then dragged it outside to the pit and just dumped him inside. Then he moves on to Russell, but as he was dragging Russell's body to the pit, he realized that Russell wasn't dead. He was wheezing. He was making this really loud wheezing sound, and it was just getting louder and louder, and George was freaking out because he was worried that the neighbors might hear. So he went and got the axe and he hit Russell for a second time, which finally did kill him. He then dumped Russell's body into the pit. Then he did the same thing with each of the other victims. He grabbed them up, threw them in the pit, and then once everyone was inside, he covered their bodies up with dirt. But he did make sure to leave space for one more person. 21-year-old Alton was due home any day now. He was coming home for Christmas from that out-of-state job that he was working on. And again, George could have walked away, but instead he chose to stay there on the farm and wait for Alton to arrive home, which finally did happen 3 days after the murders. So Alton comes home and he expected to see the farm bustling with activity, his mother cooking and decorating for Christmas, his siblings running around, playing, helping on the farm, but that's not the scene that he found. The house was empty. No one was there except for his Uncle George. George told Alton that the family went to Oklahoma to visit Susan's sister, and Alton had no reason to doubt what his uncle was saying, so he just didn't question it. That night, George and Alton killed and cooked a chicken for dinner, and then they stayed up drinking and playing card games. As the night went on, they continued to drink. George was likely encouraging Alton to drink more and more, hoping to get him so drunk that he couldn't fight back. George was going to be going up against the strength of a fully grown man. So after hours of drinking and playing card games, Alton decided to turn in. He was sufficiently drunk at this point, so he went to bed. George said that after Alton went to bed, he drank a little more whiskey to give himself the last-minute courage that he needed to kill his final victim. He grabbed his shotgun and he went into Alton's bedroom. Then he stood over his nephew, aimed the gun right at his head, and fired, killing Alton instantly. He then dragged his body to the pit, dumped him inside, and covered him up with dirt. So now the entire family is dead, except for Nora. And luckily for Nora, George would never have the chance to kill her, because unlike his first family massacre, this family massacre would quickly be discovered. So in the days following the murders of Susan and her kids, the neighbors really started to wonder about the Hassell family, especially the women in the neighborhood. A few of them started asking some questions, and anytime George was asked about the whereabouts of his family, he would say, well, we're getting ready to move back to Oklahoma, so Susan took the kids early to get them settled there, and I'm staying behind in Farwell just temporarily to settle our affairs. But some people who saw George right after the murders noticed that he had scratches all over his face and hands. But when he was asked about these scratches, he would say that he fell off his horse into a stubble field. So this was a strange explanation, but it was also plausible. So this alone didn't set off any major alarms. But then just a couple of weeks after the murders, George announced that he was going to have an auction on December 22nd, and he would be selling off pretty much all of the family's possessions. These auctions were really popular back in the 1920s. Hundreds of people would show up from all over the area. They would bid on tons of items. They would also serve a big dinner, and these events would last all day. It was a really big deal. It was like a big social event. Not only was it a great opportunity to buy nice items for low prices, but it was also a chance for people in town to get together and catch up. The men would be, smoking and drinking together, and the women would be hanging out and, talking about this and that. And on December 22nd, during George's auction, the one thing that the women couldn't stop talking about was Susan and the kids. Susan hadn't gotten super close to anyone in town, but she had made some acquaintances, and she would also go to church meetings at the homes of a lot of the women in town. And as the women are talking at the auction that day, they all realized that none of them had heard from Susan since she left. She hadn't sent letters to let anyone know that she and the kids had made it to Oklahoma safely. She had never even told them that they were leaving in the first place. none of it made sense to the women. So these estate auctions would usually take place on the actual property of the person holding the auction. So George was conducting this event on his farm. The area where people were standing and bidding was just 20 feet away from the pit where Susan and the kids were buried. So while the men were busy, outside hanging out, bidding on various items, some of the women decided to go inside the Hassell home and kind of poke around a little bit, see if they could find anything out of the ordinary. They, looked around and they didn't find any blood or any obvious signs of an attack or a struggle, but they did find several suitcases hidden in the house that had a lot of personal items belonging to Susan and the kids, items that Susan wouldn't have left behind. Some of these items included her purse, diapers for their youngest kid, Sammy, lots of warm clothes that Susan would have needed. This was all happening in the dead of winter, and Susan and the kids would have needed warm clothes to survive the trip back to Oklahoma. But the one thing that worried them the most was that Susan left behind her Bibles. They knew that Susan would have never left her Bibles behind. She would never have traveled without them. So the women are more suspicious than ever, and they put everything back where they found it so no one knows that they were rummaging through stuff. And they went back out to the auction and they acted like everything was fine. But once the auction was over, some of the women told their husbands about what they had found and about all of their suspicions, and their husbands actually took this very seriously, and they all went down to the police station and told the constable everything. George was called down to the station, but they didn't really tell him why he was being asked to come down there, but he probably already knew what it was about. He knew that people were asking questions. So once he got down to the station, the investigators flat out asked him, "Where is your family?" They just didn't believe his story that they had went back to Oklahoma, and they wanted real answers. But George just repeated the same story. They had went back home to Oklahoma. He was staying there to sell off their possessions, and he was going to be joining them. In the end, they didn't have any solid evidence, so they couldn't really keep him in custody, but that was all about to change. A couple of days later, in the early morning hours of Christmas Eve, George Hassell was found in his home with multiple stab wounds. He was rushed to the local doctor's office and taken into surgery. The wounds were mostly in his chest and abdomen, and the surgeon managed to stop the bleeding and he got him all stitched up. But now the authorities had even more questions. Who had done this to George? Did someone in Susan's family do this? Like maybe they knew what George had done to Susan and the kids and they wanted revenge? Had someone in the neighborhood done this to him, thinking that they were committing some sort of vigilante justice? Well, it turns out that the person who had stabbed George multiple times was George himself. He had done this all to himself in some sort of apparent suicide attempt. It's actually not really known if this was a legitimate attempt or if this was just George's way of trying to throw suspicion off of himself. He could feel the pressure. He knew that the townspeople were really suspicious of him. So maybe this was his way of making himself seem like a victim. We don't know. But this actually made the authorities look at him even harder. And this is when they decided, okay, this guy is acting really strangely. It's time that we check the property. We need to go search the farm. And since the neighbors had seen that weird ass pit being dug in the yard, that's where they started their search, in the pit. Police and volunteers started digging, and it took them no time at all to find exactly what they were looking for. The first body that they found was 2-year-old Sammy's, and Sammy was found with fistfuls of dirt. So it's thought that he could have still been alive when George threw him into the hole. And Sammy wasn't the only one of the victims who had handfuls of dirt. So it's very possible that several of George's victims were buried alive. The funeral was held on the very next day, on Christmas. All 9 of the family members were laid to rest in one giant grave. It was a very, very sad Christmas for the people of Farwell. And now they demanded justice. They wanted George Hassell tried and executed immediately. So after George's medical condition was stable and it was clear that the wounds were not fatal, he was taken down to the jail and questioned once again. Except this time the police had evidence. They had proof that George had been lying about his family's whereabouts because they had just buried all 9 of them that day. Now, at this point, George didn't know that the bodies had been found. He had been in the hospital and no one had told him that they found the bodies. As far as he knew, Susan and the kids were still all buried in the backyard, but authorities wasted no time in telling him exactly what they found buried at the farm. And at that point, George knew it was over. And over the next few days, George would confess to everything: the murders of Susan and the kids, his attempts to cover his tracks, the incest, the abuse of his 2 nieces, Nora and Maudie. He was like an open book. He was telling them his life story. And just when police thought that the story couldn't get any worse, George dropped another bombshell. He told them that Susan and her kids were not the first family that he had massacred. He told them that he had killed his common-law wife and her 3 kids back in 1917, but that's all he would say. He wouldn't give any names or exact exact locations. And this was actually something that George did throughout his confession and during interviews with police. He would never speak the names of his victims. So like he would refer to Susan as that woman or Maddie as the girl. He would never refer to them by name. So either he just didn't care enough to speak about them like they were actually humans, or maybe he did actually feel a little bit of remorse and he was just too ashamed to say their names. So police now know that there is another family that's been wiped out at the hands of George Hassell, and now they have to figure out who they are so their families can be notified and they can finally be laid to rest. And luckily for police, they were about to get a huge break in this case. So the murders of Susan and the 8 kids, it was huge news. Newspapers all over the country were reporting on George Hassell, the crazed axe murderer. For a while, the papers were reporting that George's weapon of choice was an axe, but of course we know that wasn't true. He only used an axe on one of his victims, his nephew Russell, but this is what the headlines were saying. And one day, not long after this case broke, a woman named Gertrude Hoffman was reading her morning newspaper when she came across a headline about George Hassell, the axe murderer, and right next to the headline, there was a photo of George, and Gertrude stopped dead in her tracks. She recognized the man in this photo, but when she met him 10 years ago, he was going by the name of George Baker, and George Baker had been the common-law husband of her sister, Marie Vogel. This woman was Marie's sister, and she actually met George at some point while Marie and the kids were still alive and living with George in California. So Gertrude contacted the police in Texas, and she told them, I am 100% positive that the guy that you have in custody is the same man that was living with my sister in Whittier, California, and my sister suddenly disappeared 10 years ago. And now I'm worried that she and the kids might be dead. He might have killed them too. So the police asked George about Marie Vogel, asked him, is this the common law wife that you told us about? But George denied it, which I don't understand. He had already told them that he killed another family. I don't understand why he wouldn't tell them her name. The only thing that I could think of is that maybe he didn't want this attention to end. He knew that if he gave up the last pieces of his puzzle, he would give his statement about the murders and that would be that. And he just didn't want all of this attention to go away. But even without George's cooperation, police did manage to figure out where the house in Whittier was located, and they started searching the property, and they eventually found the skeletal remains of a woman and 3 very young children buried under the house. Each of the victims were found face down in the hole, and they still had ropes and stockings tied around their necks. So now George's victim count that we know of is 13 if you don't count Maddie's unborn baby. But in the end, George Hassell went to trial for the murder of only one of his victims, and that was his nephew, 21-year-old Alton. The prosecutors decided to go with charges for Alton only because they knew that they could try George for first-degree murder in Alton's case. Alton's murder, without a doubt, had been planned out for days. George even admitted that he had waited days for Alton to show up and that he had to drink more whiskey to get up the courage to go in the room and shoot him while he was asleep. So there was no way for George to claim self-defense because he already said that Alton was sleeping. There was no doubt that he had committed first-degree murder in Alton's case. The prosecution also knew that if they got a guilty verdict for murder in the first degree for Alton, that was game over for George. He would be sentenced to death, no doubt. So in early January 1927, just a couple of weeks after the bodies of Susan and her kids were discovered, George Hassell was found guilty and sentenced to death by electric chair. And on Friday, February 10th, 1928, George Jefferson Hassell was executed. And that's all I have on the case of George Hassell. Thanks again to Drift for partnering with me on this video. Don't forget to check out my link in the description box to try out Drift for yourself, and you'll get 55% off when you use my code Sommer at checkout. If you find this type of content interesting, please consider subscribing to my channel. I post videos just like this as often as I can. Give this video a like or a comment because that also really helps me out. You can also follow me on Instagram at Sommer_SanchezYT. I post video updates, some random life stuff, so if you'd be interested in that, go follow me over there. And as always, I appreciate each and every one of you for watching, and I will see you next time.